I didn't do it right. Anyhow, so this is what I usually do is zoom out on the publicity still for the episode. Then I'll try and do the Rod Serling voice, and I'll ask Jeff to consider going through the first page, which is about what happened between the seasons. This is Africa, 1943. War spits its violence overhead. No, it doesn't. War spits out its violence overhead, and the sandy graveyard swallows it up. Her name is King 9, B-25 medium bomber, 12th Air Force. On a hot, still morning, she looks off from Tunisia to bomb... No. On a hot, still morning, she took off from Tunisia to bomb the southern tip of Italy. An errant piece of flak tore a hole in a wing tank, and, like a wounded bird, this is where she landed. Not to return this day, or any other day. And I'll go through this, because I'd like you to go through this stuff, Jeff, sort of commenting on the stuff that happened between seasons. Because a lot of people watch on a mobile device and can't see that well. Captain James Embry regains consciousness beside the wreckage of the King 9, utterly alone. He recalls crashing with the rest of the crew, but after that, nothing. His duty is clear. He must find his men and get them to safety. But where are they? He sees the grave of one, mirages of the entire crew, and, most peculiar of all, jet aircraft flying overhead. However, there is no trace of his men, and no indication why they left him behind. At his wit's end, Embry collapses and awakens in a hospital bed. In truth, the year is 1960. 17 years earlier, Embry fell ill and missed the last flight of the King 9. Since then, he has carried with him an enormous feeling of guilt. Spying a headline that the wreck of the King 9 had been found in the desert, he fell into a state of shock. His trip back to his plane has been a hallucination. That would seem to account for everything. But how on earth did Embry get all that sand in his shoes? And then I'll do the outro. Enigma buried in the sand. A question mark within broken wings that lies in silence grace, as a marker in a desert shrine. Odd how the real consorts with the shadows, how the present fuses with the past. How does it happen? The question is on file in the silent desert, and the answer? The answer is waiting for us in the Twilight Zone. So, Jeff, what should I ask you what you thought of the episode, or should I ask you to go through this?
Yeah, the first thing, because before I'm biased by anything that I read on
Right.
this, my first thought is to think of the Herman's Hermits song.
Yep.
Henry VIII, where it says second, first, same as the first. Because we started this first season with the episode, Where is Everybody? And this one could have been called Where is Everybody 2?
Yep.
Because in that one, it's like we establish, okay, the reason he's by himself is because he's doing space training where they're testing his faculties, physical and mental. This one has even less actual substance to it than that one did, because it's just, he's having this, guilt-ridden or guilt-induced flashbacks or whatever, And then, at the very end, it's like, let's throw in a random twist where he actually has sand in his shoes for some reason.
Yeah.
So, as I was watching it, my thought was, this is kind of boring, but again, reminiscent of that first one of Where is Everybody in terms of the setup, and actually several other episodes, I believe, where we've had a singular character trying to figure out something about where he is or what's happened. And the actor was good, and the thing that I'm like, this is a showcase kind of thing where it's basically you got to carry the entire episode with your own monologue, and it's not easy to do, but he does that pretty effectively.
Yep.
But then the ending is rather unsatisfying because uh, there isn't really any particular twist or interest to the story. It's just sort of like, oh yeah, it was just sort of a dream kind of thing, and it's got these two doctors kind of boringly talking about the situation, and then you're like, okay, there's got to be something more to this, and then it comes and it's not very satisfying either. So it's sort of like, I thought even though it would have been weirder, it almost would have been the thing I was popped in my head that would have been a better twist is if the two guys had been like, what did he mean jets? What's a jet? You know, like they'd never heard of it. Like somehow, you know, it was the opposite thing. Like somehow he was imagining the future and he knew these things and he wasn't actually like that. Yeah. That would have been a better twist than just saying there was sand in his shoes. Like, okay, you know, there's any number of ways he could have gotten sand in his shoes. So, you know, that in itself was like, okay, so what? So, yeah, it's not exactly a triumphant
Yep.
return for the second season, I would say. You know,
In
almost a little bit of a cop out, sort of like, you know, again, before reading the behind the scenes stuff, I'm thinking the show had become popular, so we just slap this thing together, call it Twilight Zone, and this will work.
I
People will
mean,
buy it. We got
I
a
mean,
brand now.
yeah. I mean, it's like, I mean, you could get away with it if you said like this was an episode in the middle of the season, but not to start the season off because these are the ones that people review and
Yeah,
write up reviews of new seasons. You got to have a good start.
yeah, definitely has a like you said, yeah, this would have been one where if I read the script or kind of saw the initial part, I'd be like, okay, work a little more on this one, and we'll get to this one later in the season, like you say. You know? Come back with something a little more oomph to it, you know, and we'll make something else the season premiere. So yeah, so it's there's nothing that's terrible or cringeworthy about it. It's just not particularly impressive in any way.
Yeah, and we do appear to have been in the desert rather a lot.
Yeah. I mean, it's good. You know, the plane is convincing and everything. Like I said, the elements are convincing in the fact, you know, the setting and the people. You know, there's nothing that stands out as going, oh, this doesn't look right. You know, of course, I don't know things about military planes, so obviously, I don't.
Yeah,
You know,
there's some.
I'm not good at spotting that sort of thing. But just as a layman that I am, as far as seeing the plane and the different elements of the dialogue, there's nothing that makes me go, oh, this was badly done. It's just not particularly impressive as a television episode of anything.
Yeah, I think he had a like. I think the lead actor had like big status, and he sort of did it for like half his usual fee,
Mm-hmm.
and it was an actual aeroplane war surplus. And I think what's more interesting is actually the first page talking about what happened in between the seasons. So
All right,
if you read
well,
through
let's
this,
get to
Jeff,
it.
and comment,
Okay.
yeah,
With the debut of the second season, Serling could rest assured that the Twilight Zone had found its audience. On the Twilight Zone, he wrote, we now hit approximately 500 letters a week. We have fan clubs in 31 states, and we get an average of 50 story ideas submitted to us each week from people who dig fantasy, the unusual, the imaginative. And this was not a frugal audience. By November 1960, sales of stories from the Twilight Zone exceeded 400,000 copies. There were more Twilight Zone products to come this year, a comic book with each story introduced by a comic book version of Serling, a record album featuring the music of Marty Manning and his orchestra and billed as an adventure in the space of sound, a board game in which players moved their pieces down various maze-like roads to reality. That'd be a fun one to see if you could get a hold of. And Serling's More Stories from the Twilight Zone, which went into a second printing 2 weeks after it was released. Where the products left off, the inventiveness of the fans took over. A black Model A Ford was seen outside a Los Angeles high school with the words The Twilight Zone painted in white across its side. And in Teaneck, New Jersey, the Twilight Zone Coffee House opened its doors for business. The show's popularity brought production bonuses too. After the first year, there was no trouble getting a cast, George Clemens recalls. The producer would suggest a name to somebody, and they'd say, "Oh well, you can't get him. The money is way out of this world." But they'd come in and do Twilight Zone for half of what they would normally get because it was prestige and it was fun for them. Despite all of this season saw only 29 episodes produced, down 7 from the previous year. In the second season, says Buck Houghton, it seemed to me that CBS was more concerned about the cost of the shows in relation to the rating it was getting than they were in either the first season or the third season. Indeed, that's the only reason we taped, to save some money. The taping that Houghton refers to is the videotaping of 6 episodes, which was done as a cost-cutting measure, a subject we will deal with later in this chapter.
Yeah. Now, that's probably not interesting to most people, but to people like Jeff and me are interested in Doctor Who and when certain things are done on tape and when certain things are done on film. That
yeah, well, I could reiterate what I've said before, is that I actually prefer things done on tape because I like the way it looks better.
Right.
The only exception is in now in modern times where they have done films at the high enough frame rate where it basically has a similar look to the videotape, despite being filmed. So those look good because to me they look more like tape, even though they're higher quality, obviously.
Yeah, and a lot of the weird things now is that lots of movies are actually shot on digital, whether it's a hard drive or digital tape, and then it gets transferred to film when it's shown in most cinemas, because most cinemas probably aren't digital yet with a digital projector. So
I thought it was the opposite. I thought more now were, but I could be wrong. I mean, I guess worldwide it may still be more film, but I mean,
yeah,
all of the theaters that I go to now here in Texas are pretty much all digital that I saw.
Right. Okay. Yeah. But yeah, it's a lot easier than making it on film because you don't know what you've got until you've got the rushes the next day. And even then, it's only a rough version of what was shot. And I think what they used to do is have a camera, a television, a video camera, slaved the side of the video of the film camera. And then they would look back on the video camera to get an approximation of what they've shot. And they'd have to, before every shot, they would say something like, clear the gate to make sure there's no hairs on the lens. You don't want to see that the next day on the rushes. So, and it cost a lot because you had to literally process all of the film in film laboratories. So that's why film was more expensive than tape and why the BBC used videotape. And I think Doctor Who was only allowed about 10 minutes of videotape in a whole story, something like that. And then there was one story when there was a strike and they let them make Spearhead from Space entirely on film. All right, but that's a bit random. But anyway, do you want to read through this, Jeff, and then like have some comments as you go through? Because this, like, I think where the story came from is more interesting than the actual thing.
I thought it was your turn.
Okay, it's my turn. Right. Okay, it's my turn. This page is my turn, and you can do the next page, hopefully. Like Where Is Everybody, the first season opener, King 9 Will Not Return, concerns a character who finds himself all alone in bizarre surroundings, with no memory of how or why he got there. And as with the previous story, this too had its basis in a factual event. In May 1959, a team of British geologists exploring the Libyan desert for oil stumbled upon the wreckage of Lady Be Good. Reminds me of Johnny Be Good. An American B-24 bomber that had disappeared on April 4, 1943. The geologists inspected the plane and found the water jugs full and the guns and ammunition intact, but no trace of the 9-man crew. The Air Force labeled the discovery one of the greatest mysteries in aviation history. This was far too intriguing for Serling to pass up. Now, I'll just say something from a technical point of view. As it said there, a 9-man crew for the B-24. They said a B-25 because it's got a smaller crew, probably. And actually, the B-24, I think it was called the B-24 Liberator, and it was sent to the Soviet Union as part of Lend-Lease, and the Soviet aviators liked it. Right. In adapting the story for the Twilight Zone, uh, Serling rechristened the plane King 9 and deposited the ship's captain. Ships? The ship's captain? It's not a ship.
I think he called himself that, though.
Yeah. Yeah.
So apparently somebody in whatever armed forces refers to him as that.
Yeah.
I mean,
Maybe.
it's a kind of ship, an airship, I guess.
And deposited the ship's captain, Robert Cummings, in the middle of the mystery, searching desperately for his lost crew in the desert amid the wreckage. The mystery of the disappearing men is never resolved, but the captain's dilemma is. And unlike Where Is Everybody in King 9, Serling was allowed his final twist. Oh, yes, brilliant. Put some. And then it says here, an unusual episode. I wish it were.
Yeah, I saw that. I'm like, yeah. I can already think of ways they could have made it more unusual and possibly more interesting.
Yeah. An unusual episode. The casting of the lead in King 9 proved unusual as well. Oh, I just want to say something from a typological point of view. Jeff and I mentioned this to Jeff yesterday, that it's not about intuitive or being a sensing type. If you've just had a load of experience of watching stuff, you can usually think of ways that it could have been done better, because we have the benefit of all of these decades of hindsight.
Yeah, and on that subject, there was one of the few insights we got into the character because we heard his internal monologue that likely a thinking type in Myers-Briggs, because he was his priority was on examining the problem logically.
Yeah, and keeping rational.
Yeah, probably an STJ, I'm thinking, because his focus was on like rationally, looking at the situation logically, but examining the facts that he had at his disposal, and also reiterating that he was the captain and the leader, so it was his responsibility to find the crew and to take care of them.
Yep. An unusual episode. The casting of the lead in King 9 proved unusual as well. I wanted Rod to do a script for me to use on one of my. You see, I wish they would say who the hell was talking first before they have the actual quote, because then I can picture it.
Yeah.
I just think the sequencing is wrong. Right. So, right. Whoever says that. Oh, no, okay. That's Cummins saying it. Right. Cummins said, I wanted Rod to do a script for me to use on one of my specials. And then Cummins continued, money is useless in a situation like that. The man is so busy that he can't be tempted with money. It was then that I worked it out. We could supply a script and I would open the new season of Twilight Zone. He would supply the script. I think I might have. Right,
yeah, so my first thought was thinking, and knowing now the origin of that the actual story is more interesting than what they did. That if you wanted to take that and put your Twilight Zone twist on it, you could have, rather than just the captain, you could have the whole crew be experiencing, this, okay, we're crashed in the desert somewhere and we got to figure out what to do kind of thing. And you could have them, still have the radio where they're trying to contact anybody and they don't have anybody. You could have them wandering around trying to find out where they are and how to get out of there. You have the whole desperation parts, just not the part about the captain not finding the crew. I mean, maybe one or two of them could be lost or something, so they could be looking for those lost members. But you have more, the group is existing in this reality, basically.
Yeah.
And then the end of the episode, you have the people who discover the plane and there's no sign of the crew. So the implication is that somehow they've gone to whatever other dimension where they're existing. Like you could have the plane disappear, so it's like they can't find the plane now anymore. And the plane is back in the other world. So then they find the plane empty and don't know where the crew is, but they're in this other place. So that's already an idea where I didn't really have to think too hard to come up with that idea. And to me, that would have been more interesting than what they did.
Yeah, I mean, it could be an interesting competition to rerun, like base the story on this better than that, and there are lots of interesting possibilities
Yeah,
from
because I
that.
mean
Yeah,
that idea is obviously that idea. That kind of thing has been thought of many times before,
yeah,
especially something like the Bermuda Triangle, where they've had all the disappearances that have been unexplained. Where they've there's from the very
right.
first time I heard of that, my thought was uh, the theory about there being some sort of alternate Earth that people go through, like some sort of
Right.
portal into that other thing. And I even had that idea when I was a kid. When we were
Yeah.
in school, we were assigned something to like create our own country and stuff like that. And some people would like put the country in a particular place on the map. Uh, but I had that reality thing setting in where I was like, but it's not really there on the real map. So I had to come up with an explanation. I had to come up with a fantastical explanation to make the reality part make more sense. So then I was like, oh, well, you go through this portal in the Bermuda Triangle and you go to the other Earth where then these countries exist. So that was my explanation for that.
I think I remember seeing a theory about the Bermuda Triangle that certain seismic activity and certain gases were released in the atmosphere around there that messed up the aircraft. It was a long time ago that I saw
Yeah,
that
I watched
television
an
program.
Unsolved Mysteries that was about that. That was pretty interesting because they talked about various theories for things that happened there. But
Just sort of see if there's anything worth looking at here in terms of a close up. Not really. I like the name of the aircraft, King 9. It's a snappy title.
except when I see K9, I'm instantly thinking of the dog.
Yeah. And uh,
Not well, not just the Doctor Who dog, but
the movie?
also the like various um, things where the letter K and number 9 have been used to be K9 for the dog. So
Yeah.
think of that instead of a card.
I think even police do that, don't they? Like they'll call their unit K and 9.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Canine
Um,
Squad.
hey, I got another bit from me. Except for the final scenes in the hospital, King 9 was shot entirely on location in the desert near Lone Pine, California. A war surplus B-25 was bought from the Air Force for $2,500, down from an original cost of $345,000, disassembled, flown to the location, and reassembled there. Now, if Jeff would do the honors, this final page. I'll try and
Production
get it made
manager
up.
Production manager Ralph W. Nelson then ingeniously solved the challenge of transporting the cast and crew by arranging for a DC-3 to land on the highway right next to the location. Director Buzz Kulik was a newcomer to the Twilight Zone with King 9, but he soon proved himself one of the series' ablest directors. Kulik's great strength as a director lay in his ability to work with actors, a fact borne out by his television work since The Twilight Zone, which has included Kill Me If You Can, the story of Carol Chessman starring Alan Alda, and Brian's Song. Since King 9 was virtually a one-man show, Kulik's attention to characterization and his willingness to engage in lengthy rehearsal greatly enhanced the production. Additionally, challenging was the fact that during most of the show, Cummings's lines were contained in voiceover interior monologues, obviously Serling's alternative to the clumsy verbal monologues in Where Is Everybody? There's still plenty of clumsy verbal monologues, though. In order to allow Cummings's facial expressions to match his thoughts, the voiceovers were pre-recorded at MGM and then played back on location. The attention to detail paid off. As Hank Grant wrote in The Hollywood Reporter, this was a tour de force for Robert Cummings, an extremely difficult role that ran the gamut from relief to joy to panic to crazed hysteria, a performance that should merit serious consideration when Emmy time comes around. Yeah, and I can agree in the sense that I don't fault anything in the performance, but the reason it really can't be a tour de force is because the script's not interesting enough.
Yeah.
So it's like you can give a good actor material and he can make it better than it could be on paper just by performing it well. But there still has to be more to it, in my opinion.
Yeah. I mean, my favorite desert one out of the desert ones that they've done was the guy, and they had the robot woman, and it was Jean Marsh.
Yeah.
That was my favorite desert episode.
Yeah, and I think I probably agree with you off the top of my head on that. And we've had worse too, because there was the worst one about the space crew that thought they were on another planet, and then it turned
Yeah.
out to be like out in the middle of California desert where they were
Yeah.
actually filming it. sorry to spoil that one for anybody who hasn't seen that, but that was kind of a lousy episode.
Yeah,
It was
and
better than that, just because there wasn't anything like cringeworthy about it. It just wasn't that interesting. It definitely, like they said, for a season premiere, it was kind of lackluster. So
yeah, I'm just going to try and speed up the slideshow because I want people to see all the slides, but sort of get it to go round about the new slide every 2
But yeah,
seconds or
those
something.
quotes from Serling there at the beginning of that chapter about the second season almost kind of confirmed what I was saying about it. Seemed like the popularity had sort of made him a little full of himself in terms of thinking that they didn't maybe have to put out the same effort they did in the first season to have people like it or get better ratings. Because the show had a brand that was going to carry it.
I think maybe he
kind of disappointing.
I think maybe he got obsessed with the actual real story, and the real story was really interesting, and he maybe like mentally transferred the actual mystery of the real thing onto his episode, and he probably didn't realize that it didn't really transfer as well.
Well, that's what I was actually saying. If it had been closer to the real story, it might have actually been better. Because to me, there's something. It's more compelling to have. Man, I'm trying to think of how to say this without well, I don't know. It's long enough ago. I'm not going to worry about it. Say, if you don't want a plot of a Star Trek: The Next Generation episode to be spoiled, then tune out here. So, either my favorite or definitely one of my favorite Star Trek: Next Generation episodes has the plot of Dr. Crusher basically slowly tries to figure out what's happening as members of the Enterprise crew are disappearing. And not only disappearing, but the remaining people don't know who she's talking about. Like, they have no memory of these people's existence. She's the only one who realizes they ever existed. And meanwhile, these sort of logical paradoxes are happening in that she's like, why do we have this big ship and all these things to have this big crew if we only have this small number of people? And nobody can give her an explanation for that. They just all kind of like act like she's losing her mind.
That sounds good.
And yeah, and actually, I can tell this without even really spoiling the major twist in it by saying that even in that episode, as good as it is, I still look at it and think it would have been even cooler if they hadn't revealed what was really happening until the last few minutes. If they'd had the scene where when she gets back, I'll put it that way, to sort of the reality of what's happening. If they had waited to kind of reveal what was going on until that scene, and they could have even had that happen, not at the very end of the episode, but like, just not reveal those other things, reveal the sort of other story that was happening after the fact, after they revealed the twist, then they go back and show, okay, this was what was happening at the same time, instead of trying to sort of do it concurrently. I think that would have been more effective. But the point is that it was a similar thing to what I was talking about, in that it was sort of examining two different perspectives on the same setting. So in something like this, if you had the crew is trying to figure out what happened and where they are, and then you have the people that actually discovered the plane trying to figure out, the same thing from a different perspective, because they're seeing the plane and not the people. And in my idea for the episode, it would be the people, the crew is trying to figure out what happened and where's the plane. That would be sort of what the thing going on in the two different worlds, or whatever you want to say it is.
Yeah.
So to me, that makes for a much more interesting story than this as it is, because it's almost like I understood, as I said when we reviewed Where Is Everybody, why at the beginning they felt like they couldn't be too bizarre with that. They had to have the reasonable explanation for what was happening, because it was sort of, they were still trying to sell the show at that point and get people who maybe aren't into the more weirder kind of versions of sci-fi. They were trying to get to hook them in, make them convinced this was a quality show. So they had to say, oh, this, okay, we've given you this bizarre scenario, but now we're giving you this reasonable explanation for what's actually occurring. So you can go, oh, okay. And the people that are not into the more bizarre things are going to say, all right, well, that was a good piece of relevant, whatever, relevant plot, the story that could have happened in reality. I don't have to swallow some kind of weird concept to believe this. But now, by the time you have established the brand, as all that stuff was saying, you actually have more freedom to go a little bit more out there and have people accept it, because, as Serling himself said, well, it's the Twilight Zone. So this one, it almost seemed like I said, sort of a reboot of the show, where they were saying, oh, here's this thing that's happening, and here's our perfectly reasonable explanation. But wait, then we have this little unexplained thing at the end, but it's not really that interesting. So it's sort of like they don't go all the way with either way. Either they make it a boring but perfectly explainable situation where it's compelling only because of the performance of the captain, or you make it much more out there and you have these bizarre things going on and don't necessarily have a reasonable, rational explanation for them. But you kind of got to go all the way either direction. Instead, they don't do either one.
Right. What I thought about this is, if I was to show somebody a Twilight Zone episode and they were to pick one at random, and if this one was picked and they were there watching it, I would be cringing a little bit, thinking it's a lot better than this. Why did it have to land on this episode?
Yeah, and in my opinion, not cringing because there was anything that made me that was embarrassing about it. Just that it's not compelling. There's not the things that make Twilight Zone good, other than just the quality of the acting and the mood, the atmosphere of things. Like that's the only thing that's really showcased here, because the storytelling is definitely not.
Because I'm like you, where it's about like you said as a kid, you wanted to share the music that you liked, and you felt that your father wasn't allowing you to share the things that you love. And I like to share certain television programs and a certain series, and in that vein, and if I think it's an episode, it doesn't live up to it, it makes me feel bad, because it's not representing the thing that I like very well. I want it to be up to standard.
Right. Yeah, I can think of several others I definitely would pick to represent the show better.
I like that one where they arrived on a funeral place, and there was that huge mystery about why there were people frozen.
Yeah, that one's well done. There's obviously we both agreed on what the best episode overall of the first season was, but it wouldn't even necessarily have to be that one to represent like what was good about the show. Because the one you just mentioned would be a good example of kind of and the other one about the the robot that you mentioned, and the one with the all the frozen people that were like mannequins or whatever,
Yeah. You know what else?
Another one that was popped in my head now. I can't remember which one it was.
You like the one with was it Burgess Meredith with the glasses at the end? Is that the one that we picked?
Yeah, that was the one I was saying that we agreed last year was the best episode overall the first season. But
and that's the one that Dennis Miller referenced once.
Yeah, the one with the child, where the woman sees the child version of herself talking to her. That's another one. That was, I think I said at the time, was the first episode where I was watching. I was thinking, this is what I think of as being like the quintessential Twilight Zone. Like if I was going to show somebody, like this represents the typical good quality, mysterious, cool Twilight Zone.
And the girl, her performance was brilliant with the little
Yeah.
snippets of humor. Lovely.
Yeah.
And I also like that one where you had the woman that was living as a mannequin, and then she forgot she was a mannequin.
Yeah, that one to me was only spoiled by the ending. You know, it just
Yeah.
was one of those. There were several that kind of petered out at the end. It didn't really have a satisfactory ending, but had a cool setup, and that was definitely one of those.
I like
Which,
that.
as I think I said at the time, there's a lot of shows that have that problem where they're much better at setting up the premise than they are at figuring out how to pay it off. As I said several times when we were doing Blake 7 reviews, there were quite a few of those episodes where they came up with this great, cool concept, and then it was like, okay, now what do we do with it? And they didn't really figure out how to do that.
And of course, that always suffered from the problem of, well, you have Servalan in the same scene as them, and they should be trying to shoot her.
Yeah, without even getting into those problems where you have ridiculous setups of that you didn't have to get into. Even setting that aside, there were too many episodes that they came up with a cool concept for sort of like a mysterious thing that was occurring, and then the explanation just was dumb.
Yeah, I mean, what I would have done with that, I would have just put a gadget in. Servalan carries around a personal shield. Boom. She cannot.
Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds of things you could have done that would have made some of those things make more sense, that they just failed on.
She carries this thing around where if you shoot her, it bounces off and then hits you back.
But, you know, obviously from the behind the scenes stuff about that I learned from you and the books that you read for that, it just seemed like once Terry Nation was not involved day to day in the production of the show, they just lost their direction, kind of spun into.
Oh yeah, I loved season 2 with all of the stuff with Star 1. That's when you had the proper dynamic between Avon and Blake. And then when Blake went, it was like Avon, and also the actor changed his performance and became a bit more expressive and less INTJ, more like himself.
And that phenomenon has occurred on a ton of shows where you had the people that were the driving creative force for the show at some point left the show, but the network or the production company or wanted to continue the show, and they did, but the direction just became either went the wrong way or just went all over the place because the creating force behind the show was just, they were the ones that held everything together. And so as soon as they weren't responsible for it, it just became sort of a shell of its former self. I think that I could list off, probably a dozen examples of that because it's happened a lot with shows that ran. People will say the show ran too long, and I don't think that's necessarily the case always. It's the show could have continued to be great if the same people had been in charge of it, but then once those people left, it kind of just went downhill.
Yeah, and I think, and we're going off topic here, but I think this is a good point before really, and that is that with Avon and Blake, because Blake was arguably a terrorist, and so Avon's criticisms of Blake were actually quite on point, and so he will saying things like he will fight to the last drop of their blood, and things like that, and you can still.
I almost think that people who take over TV shows somewhere in the middle, or people that write for TV shows, should almost be like required to watch the first episode or the first few episodes like repeatedly, not just once. Like from time to time, they should have to do that so they remind themselves like what the show is supposed to be, or where, and I'm not saying obviously that not every show peaks with the beginning. That's not what I'm saying, but just to remind themselves, here's how this show started, what sort of the basis is. Just sort of remind yourself of that, because it's sort of people. I think they get so far off course because it's like they don't go back and watch or listen to that, so they don't remind themselves about what. Because as soon as you started talking about that, I started thinking, there's so many different cool things they could have done with that concept if they had just sort of remembered it.
Yeah, all they need,
remembered what the premise of the show was.
You need a writer who's also a fan with that fanish attention to detail. So, for example,
but not one that's just trying to do what I learned the British expression fan wank, where it's just about look how cool would it be if we had these random characters meet each other, or that kind of bizarre stuff.
All the things. Apparently, they would keep getting the story. Daleks fight the Cybermen.
Yeah.
Well, there was rights issues on that, and then when they eventually did it, it was awful. Absolutely awful, because what they did is they had one Dalek destroy a load of Cybermen, and I was thinking, no, this is not how you do it. You got to do it the way it is in Alien versus Predator, where they're equal strength.
Yeah.
But what was I going to say about?
Yeah, honestly, if you go that concept, that repeatedly they showed that one Sontaran was probably stronger than any one of any of those other aliens. So if they ever actually had an actual full army of Sontarans, they could probably take over any of the other Doctor Who races.
Yeah, no.
Because one was as effective, and they were supposedly all clones. So if you just had a whole army of them, you'd have no shot.
Yeah, because like they talked about, but also they could take huge losses because there were so many of them, and they had this.
And that eventually they also did in the new series, and did it terribly. So it's just an example of they just don't know what to do with the characters. They
don't follow the logic of the world. You've got to follow and to be honest, it's a lack of intelligence in not being able to work within those rules of the rules of that universe.
Yeah, and that's another one, especially when you have a show that goes that long, that I think they should be required to sit down and watch the first stories, because it's like, here's how this started, here's the direction, and go from there. Come up with a story that fits in this universe, instead of going, now the Doctor is a action hero which makes faces to the camera for the kiddies, and stuff.
Yeah.
Because when they started the show, it was aimed at kids, and they still made it a compelling show.
Oh.
So it proves you can do that, and you don't. And people that are like, "Well, that was the '60s; it was a different time." Like, kids are still kids; they're the same.
Yeah.
You can, and I proved that myself by showing original Doctor Who to 6- and 7-year-old kids, and them loving it. So I mean, once again, shows that if you don't like pander to kids and try to be like, oh, we're gonna have everybody make goofy faces and act all self-absorbed and all this stuff,
And you showed it to somebody who grew up to be very cynical in ESTP, ultimate realism person. So if that person liked it at that young age,
well, right, yeah. I mean, and I showed it at a birthday party that he had, and the only. I won't even hesitate to even say objection. There were no objections. The only question I got was one kid didn't understand why it wasn't in color, and that was about it. That was the only, and even that, it wasn't like a deal breaker. It was just, just sort of a observation.
The truth be told, what kids love is a good story. That's why they like the Harry Potter stuff.
Oh yeah, and that's why you can read kids' books written, 200 years ago, and they or play music from many decades ago. Radio Disney would, at least in the past, I don't know if they still do this, but they would intersperse like modern hit songs with stuff like James Brown from the 60s,
right?
Or things like that, where it's like kids don't care how old something is, it's just whether it's fun or not.
So this combination of, you have somebody who is a fan, who loves the original series and is a good writer, so they know what to change and what to keep. And so what the showrunner they got when they did Star Trek Enterprise, when they got to the 4th season, they had the showrunner Manny Koto. This guy was a fan of the original Star Trek, and he was a good writer, and so he was able to do stories that went into the backstory and come up with good explanations. For example, why the Klingons didn't have those bumpy foreheads in the original series, and all of these stuff. I think he did three-parters, and it was like really good stories, just weaving things together. And I was like, now it's got really good. And then they cancelled the bastard on me. After all that time it took Star Trek to get good, with this good writer who really loved the details and really loved the world. That's what we ask for. that the person take it seriously within the world, even if the world is silly.
A good
take it
example
seriously
to me
within that.
was the newer, obviously not new anymore. It's been like 10 years or whatever, but the newer version of V, that's based on the original V miniseries. I still like the original better, but I grew to like the new version for what they did with it. And just when it had really gotten good and compelling, and they came up with a really good like cliffhanger at the end of the second season, then of course they were canceled and didn't come back for a third season. But I never doubted the sincerity of the people who made that show. They did a good job of that. I didn't necessarily agree with all their choices, and there were a couple of fan wanky things in there where they were like, well, we're going to bring back this actor who was in the original playing a different character, but there's no real compelling reason to think this character is interesting. So I think they could have done those aspects better. But the new characters they created and stories, like they came up with some pretty cool stuff. Like some of the sort of updates or changes they made to the original story were really good and very effective for what they were. For instance, in the original, the aliens had studied the Earth for a while, but this show started with them just getting here. Whereas in the new version, they had sent like advanced scouts to actually live on the planet for several decades before they made themselves known. So it wasn't just studying from afar. It was like they were actually infiltrating the culture. So, which makes more sense from the aspect of sort of the conspiracy aspects, where they were able to infiltrate all of these parts of society around the world. So they already had those influencers in place when they actually brought the rest of them to the planet. So they had all this infrastructure already set up to help them and be able to basically take over the planet. So I thought all those aspects were pretty cool that they changed for the new.
Yeah, and it's following the rules of the world, the rules of the setting, so that the audience has an idea of what is possible and what isn't possible in this world, and so you don't get the audience reaction of that's a cheat. We don't want cheats. We don't want gimmicks. We want it to be resourceful solutions within the reality of that world. Yeah. And you made a good point there about sincerity. You can still be funny. You don't have to be meta and postmodern. You can still be very funny and yet also sincere.
Well, yeah, there's plenty of opportunities for humorous things to occur without them being like, oh, look at how clever I am about every stupid thing that you put in there.
I think a good example is J Michael Straczynski. He started out as a writer in about 1978. Yes, he went on to write Babylon 5, and before that he worked as script editor on Murder, She Wrote. But he worked on He-Man, She-Ra, Princess of Power, and Larry DiTillo worked on those as well.
And the real Ghostbusters.
Yes, script editor on the real Ghostbusters. And do you reckon that's a good example, Jeff? He really stayed within that world and worked on good plot details of those stories.
And he even wrote scripts to come up with explanations for other writers' stupid abandoning of the world, like you were just talking about. Like when other writers would just change something because it was convenient to them, he would then write an episode where they had something that explained how that other thing happened and made sense within the context of their universe.
Yeah.
Like, for instance, they changed a few of the voice actors, and most of them tried to sound pretty similar to the original. But the one they had that was Janine, the secretary girl, like her entire like personality and voice and everything changed for no explained reason. So he wrote an episode where they went back and said that it was this supernatural force that had changed her or made her change over time, but nobody noticed because it was so like subtle or whatever, So I thought that was great.
Yeah. And that's the kind of thing I love, because you are being that's actually what I call meta ultra realism, where you are being postmodern, but you're doing it to make it more real than real by having good reasons in there.
Yeah, they did that on Buffy the Vampire Slayer too, by having they sort of played with the sitcom trope of having the sibling that's suddenly introduced that everyone acts like has always been there. And they did the same thing, but she had a little sister that had never been on there before, but then they came up with this supernatural reason why that.
This is a pretty good plot.
Yeah. So yeah, there's another example of that same thing.
And what it shows though is that if writers do play by the rules, it forces you to be more creative, and you'll get more respect for it, rather than just having these cheats and these gimmicks.
Yeah.
Of like, say the Doctor has a hand cut off, and just because it's been regenerated, he can just quickly grow a new one. No, that's a gimmick.
Yeah,
that's
or
not
the
ingenious.
sonic screwdriver does everything that you need it to do in the plot, no matter what, no matter how ridiculous.
That's lazy. We want ingenious writing.
Yeah, basically, I think I was talking with Morgan not that long ago, where like we watched quite a while ago the parody Doctor Who that was like a children's special where Rowan Atkinson played the Doctor, and like all of the things they made up to be like the most ridiculous parody of Doctor Who that had like basically every concept they did in that came true in the actual show later on. Like they did all of those things and tried to present it seriously.
Yeah.
Including turning the Doctor into a woman. That was like the last that's like the last joke in that show, that they do that, and then they made that the real thing.
Yeah, but that was a good woman. I mean, the papers though in the 80s, Jeff, they were right, and they campaigned for Joanna Lumley to be the Doctor, and she would have been a brilliant Doctor. Really, she would have been brilliant. I don't know if you've seen her in other things, Joanna Lumley.
No, but it's like I said, like literally all the jokes they then actually went back to. Like they
addressed them in the series.
Yeah, exactly.
I used to get Doctor Who magazine, and it's like, so they had that thing in Quick the Stairs, and even Tom Baker. Oh yes, I was just going to say something about Tom Baker. Tom Baker had a lot of gravitas in his voice and a lot of presence. So even when he was silly on camera, because you took him seriously in that part, he was able to grab it back and make it serious. But with these newer ones, they haven't got the presence and the gravitas to get the ship back on course to seriousness. They've just been silly.
The closest one was, I don't remember his name now. The older guy, the last guy before they switched to the woman, but he was the closest, but he still couldn't save it.
Capaldi, I think it's Capaldi.
Yeah, right. Him. He was the closest to what you would call a proper Doctor that they had on the news show. Although Matt Smith had his moments, I thought he really at the beginning, like in his very first episode, like and sometimes after that demonstrated that he could have been a proper Doctor as well.
Oh yeah,
actually had better writing.
I've seen him in other things. I saw him in The Crown playing Prince Philip in ESTP, and he did very well in that role. It's just the writing was bad, and one of the interesting things is you know this because you know about acting, but the audience might know there's how you act a choice, and then there's the actual choice that you make. And so for instance, Sylvester McCoy, I think, would make good choices, but I don't think he had the acting ability to pull those choices off. I like the way he designed his characterization for the Doctor. It's like trying to get this mysterious, more powerful person, but he wasn't really a proper actor. He was more of a comedian.
I read a review, a particular critic in the Chicago Tribune that said the same thing about Mark Harmon, that basically said he was always like limited by his ability to pull off what he was trying to do with the character. And they basically said he's never going to be anything but Mark Harmon trying to be whatever this is.
But it's not.
I thought the same thing about Tom Cruise for a long time,
right.
But what I realized is there are moments where that's not the case. Like Tom Cruise sort of has, and I don't know really if it's anything to do with his actual effort or whether it's directors or who it is but it's like certain times he's able to deliver a much better performance where it does seem like he's becoming the character instead of just Tom Cruise pretending to be the guy.
Catherine Farver says that it's usually he's very good at playing Enneagram Type 3s because he's a 3 himself. But yeah, he's not as bad an actor as what people think, and he's quite...
and that's what I had to learn is because originally there was probably a little built-in bias there because he was such like the sex symbol or whatever of my time growing up, that it was like, oh, women just thought he was going to be great no matter what he did, and he could just smirk, and it was like, oh, he's so amazing, But I had to sort of admit after a while, I'm like, he does have really good acting performances in him. It's just most of his movies are not that.
Yeah, I
And
heard
they don't
that.
require that because a lot of the movies he's in, like, it's just the character he's playing pretty much can be just Tom Cruise being this guy.
Yeah,
I mean, that was
I
the case in Rain Man. I mean, Rain Man is a showcase for Dustin Hoffman,
yeah.
but Tom Cruise had to be adequate enough. He had to play that character opposite him in a way that worked. He couldn't like embarrass and he doesn't. He comes forth as he's Tom Cruise being this dude, and that's all that's necessary in that movie.
Yeah, I heard that. I've not seen it myself, but I heard that he gave a good performance in Born on the 4th of July when he was directed by Oliver Stone.
Yeah, that's an example of what I was talking about, and I think a lot of people at that time, that was really the first movie where I think there were people that were kind of in that same opinion. Oh well, Tom Cruise is not really anything special, and then they saw that and were like, well, maybe he is. And to me, I never saw Born on the 4th of July all the way through. A lot of people thought it was a really good movie, so I'm just sort of taking their word for it that it's quality. But a better example to me almost of that is in the movie Far and Away, because it's really not that great a movie, but Tom Cruise gives a good performance in it. So it's kind of, to me, it almost is better proof of an actor's ability when they're in a movie that's not as good, but they come off where their performance, you go, oh, yeah, that was really the thing that held that together, if anything did, which is what I said, of course, about John Turturro and the Transformers movie.
He's good. John Turturro he's brilliant.
Yeah,
and also you could say that about Patrick Troughton as the second Doctor. Like in some not great stories, he was brilliant.
Well, right, yeah. I mean, but that's the kind of thing is when you have a Dustin Hoffman or John Turturro, somebody that can be placed in a bad movie and still be worth watching because of their performance, and that's when, to me, you really have an actor that sets himself apart from others.
Yeah, I mean, I might even consider watching the new Doctor Who if James Callis played the role. He would be absolutely brilliant as the Doctor, and just watch him playing Gaius Baltar in the remake of Battlestar Galactica. So did you see Tom Cruise in Interview with the Vampire, Jeff? I think he did a British accent in that.
No,
I think that was the name of the film.
I've
not sure.
Recently watching Dark Shadows, but I'm really not into vampire stuff very much. So
no.
Anyway, at the time, I didn't really have much interest in that. But anyway, we've gone way off of Twilight.
Right, yeah, but I think that's an example, though. J. Michael Straczynski is an example of the writer that we both like, where take it seriously within the world that you create.
So in whatever version, and I confess I have not kept up with it, but so I don't even know if they're actually making new Twilight Zone episodes. But at some point, they brought back a new version or something, and so if that is in fact still occurring, then get him to write some Twilight Zone, and maybe that'd be good.
Yeah, because he actually did it in the 80s, and he was the script editor on Twilight Zone in the 80s. Okay.
So even more.
And there's a little interview with him in that book. So I give this one 5. What do you give it?
I will give it the same. I agree. So 5 out of 10. That is, to me, it's like it's not bad, but there's nothing really good or compelling about it other than just the actor gives a performance. Everyone's convincing in what they do. There's just not much for them to do. So
yeah, the reason I give it a 5, folks, is because I know that Twilight Zone is better than this, and because they've done similar stories. That's pretty much why. Otherwise, it would have been about a 7 if I was being very generous.
Yeah, 7's usually kind of like my average score, and I would say this is below average because of the things I mentioned. It's just not up to snuff for what they're capable of. So.
For what it should be.
All right, so join us next time for The Man in the Bottle.
Are you sure it's that one? Okay, we'll do that one. Okay, bye-bye.
That's next. All right. So.
Okay, I'll do that one.
Okay.